Okay, great. So yeah, as Alberto said, we have a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds here: philosophy, medicine, economics, some psychology. So we thought it would be useful to just clarify some of the jargon that's going to be used. And I will start with this notion of scale norming and with a slightly more, I guess, conceptual discussion. And then Casper will talk a bit more about the reporting function and give a slightly more formal discussion. And then Michael's presentation will then kind of continue on some of these themes. Okay, so I'll just dive right in. So we have here a kind of typical life satisfaction scale question. This one is from the Hilda panel from Australia, where I'm from, which is used in a lot of life satisfaction research. All things considered, how satisfied are you with your life at this time on a scale of 1 to 10? And I think an important question to ask that I think we could really deepen our understanding of is what goes on cognitively and linguistically when people answer such questions. Now, I think a very helpful framework for starting to think about this comes to us from Andrew Oswald's paper in 2008. And we're very fortunate that Andrew will be in and out of this workshop over the next 2 days. And the basic idea is that there is some function that maps people's subjective assessments of their life into responses on a scale question of some sort of scale. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to focus mostly on the y-axis and particularly on the cognitive aspects of that. And then Casper, I think, focuses a little bit more on the x-axis. So what goes on in this process? So we'll start by making subjective assessments of their life, which will designate Li star. I'm using here a framework developed by Marc Fleuret and Blanchette in 2013, and Marc's with us in this session, which is really exciting. So a couple of ways that they might go about this. So they might consider all possible lives that are available to them or possible for them. So we can designate this Li, a vector, and then they evaluate their own life in relation to that wider vector. Or they could evaluate their life, Li star, and then think about possible better and worse lives. Either way, we end up with this vector, so size and direction, of subjectively assessed lives, Li, including the individual's own life, Li star, and then the reporting function maps that vector into the scale that they're being presented with. So in the Hilda case, the 1 to 10 scale, and it maps their own life, Li star, into a response category. So we'll designate that R. Now for welfare analysis, I think we are interested in Li star relative to the other lives in that vector, but all we ever observe is R. And I think this raises a lot of kind of interesting quandaries for empirical research, and particularly for welfare analysis on the basis of that empirical research. So digging a bit deeper, Fleuret and Blanchette analyzed 3 cognitive problems that people need to solve when they're reporting their subjective well-being on these kind of scale instruments: the scope, ranking, and calibration problems. And I think there could be others, but these are a very good starting point. So the scope problem is about what window of time, people, probability, etc., that we should consider when we're populating this vector of possible lives. So if you think back to that Hilda question, is your life, when people answer that, do they really focus strictly on themselves, or do they also consider their family, their friends, the state of their society, that sort of thing? When they're asked at this time, do they really think right now, or are they considering kind of the past week, the past month, the past year? And I think there are some interesting conceptual tensions in this in the subjective well-being literature, where we want to differentiate between experienced well-being, which is a kind of very affective concept, and evaluated well-being. But then we also talk about that evaluated well-being as being how you feel right now. But it's how you feel right now about your life in general. So it's unclear what the temporal frame is. And then finally, in the terms of like a Cantrell's ladder of life question, which asks you about your best possible life and worst possible life, how do people think about possible in that context? So do they consider extremely unlikely situations like being in a world war, or do they really stay in the realm of the probable? So if the scope problem is about selecting relevant considerations for what you're going to populate your vector with, the ranking problem is about how you weight those considerations. So if you consider both how your family's going and how society is going, what's the relative balance between those two things? Another way to think about it is, how do you arrange this nebulous collection of possible lives that you've assembled into a ranking and an ordered vector? The calibration problem is then how you map that vector, which might be hundreds or even thousands of possible lives, into the limited number of response categories that you have on the response scale, and how do you pile different lives into individual numbers. Scale norming arises when people solve these reporting problems in different ways across survey instances. And the result of that is that you may end up with incomparable scales, and arguably you may have incomparable responses on those scales. So here I've tried to graphically represent that. So on the x-axis, you have annual waves of a survey like Hilda. On the y-axis, you have life satisfaction. Now, strictly speaking, if it's a vector, then you would just have low to high here. But I find it a bit easier to communicate if you put numbers on that scale. So here I've assumed cardinality. I don't think cardinality is a reasonable assumption, but we'll hear a more optimistic perspective from Michael in the next session. So here we have a situation where this person's life satisfaction, their subjective assessment of their life, does not change over the 5 years. So we see that in the black line that's flat. Then each year you have the 1 to 10 scale represented in red that they use to answer that life satisfaction question. So in the first period, maybe this person has 10 out of 10 associated with something very improbable for them. Maybe they think, oh, what if I was Jeff Bezos, or what if I was Roger Federer, or something like that. And so they think, well, relative to that kind of life, I'm not doing so well, so I'm 4 out of 10. And then in the next period, when they have exactly the same life and they're just as satisfied with it, they change what they associate with 10 out of 10 to something a bit more reasonable for them. And so now they think, well, relative to that, I'm actually doing pretty well, so I'm 6 out of 10. Now, if we, the researcher, are observing this person's responses over time, we see 4, 6, 6, 4, 6. We think there's a lot of volatility in this person's satisfaction, but actually the volatility is in the scale that they're using, not in their satisfaction. And it's very hard for us to disentangle these two issues. How might these kind of things arise? There's a lot of ways that it could happen, but I'll just pull out a few quickly. So from the scope problem, if we're talking about this week, maybe this week is an unusual week in the scheme of my broad year. And if you asked me at a different week, I would give you a slightly different response. Maybe in one year, I'm thinking really about the week. The next year, I'm thinking more about the year in general. Are these scales then comparable? And I think that's an open question. In terms of the ranking problem, I think one of the most salient issues here is about focusing illusions. So because this exercise, the ranking problem, is very complex, cognitively difficult, different things will rise to salience almost at random when people answer these questions, or could rise at random when people answer these questions. So one year when you're asking them, they might really focus on how their career's going, and they might give you a low answer. And then the next year, when their career is going exactly the same way as the previous year, and their rock climbing is also going exactly the same way as the previous year, this second year, they focus more on the rock climbing, which is going relatively well, and they now give you a higher answer. But the life that they're living is the same in both cases, and the extent to which they're satisfied with their life overall is the same in both cases. They're just focusing on something a bit different. And then the calibration issue, I think an easy way to get your head around this is if you think back to high school and university and generous versus strict graders. So you could have two professors who assess work the same way in terms of its quality, but then map that quality into a different grade numerically. Similarly, I think it's interesting to think about whether this well-established empirical regularity that extroverts report higher levels of life satisfaction than introverts is a function of them feeling better about their lives, which is quite possible, or whether it's just that they have this kind of positive disposition that causes them to map that life satisfaction in a more positive way into their scale responses. And that raises an interesting question about, like, well, if you made everyone in the population more extroverted, would you be increasing welfare overall? All right, so I think this points to a big question, which is, do scales need to be qualitatively similar in order for meaningful comparisons to be made between numerical life satisfaction reports? So if I say I'm 8 out of 10 at time 1, when I'm mostly thinking about my family, and 8 out of 10 at time 2, when I'm mostly thinking about the state of the world, are those responses meaningfully comparable? And I think a key thing here is, well, are my feelings the same between these two periods? And the only reason why the scale changes is because kind of what's coming to salience in my thinking is different, but my feelings are the same. And then there's a question of whether these scales are tapping those consistent feelings or not. Okay, now I think one case where scale norming might arise that is really pernicious and is definitely a problem, even if you're very optimistic about the issues that I raised on the previous slide, is the possibility of ceiling effects. So this is where you get so high in your scale and your life keeps improving that you can't communicate further improvements. So instead of changing your scale response, you instead change your scale. So here we have an individual who in the first wave is 7 out of 10, and that corresponds to their latent and their reported life satisfaction. Then their life gets a bit better. They say they're 8 out of 10. And then in wave 3, it gets better again. And now on their original scale, they would be 10 out of 10. But they don't want to imply that their life couldn't be better because they can still see that there's further improvements to be made. So instead of saying that they're 10 out of 10, they say that they're 8 out of 10 again. But this 8 out of 10 corresponds to a higher level of latent life satisfaction than the 8 out of 10 that they reported in wave 2. Now, why would someone communicate like this? Why didn't they say 5 out of 10 on the first scale or 1 out of 10? Well, it might be that they don't want to seem ungrateful. You know, they say, oh, my life's pretty good, but it could be better. And that's true for every wave of this survey. But we as a welfare analyst look at this person's responses, 8, 8, 8 in waves 2, 3, 4, and think, well, their life satisfaction hasn't improved at all. But actually it's improving a lot. We're just not observing the way that their scale changes. All right, very quickly, I just want to differentiate this kind of scale norming from adaptation and from reference point shifts. So adaptation is about a change in your feelings, not a change in your reporting style. So we can see here in the graph that the 1 to 10 red bars are identical across the 5 waves of this survey. This person's scale stays the same. In the third wave, something befalls them and they have a reduction in life satisfaction. Maybe they have an accident and they receive a facial scar. So their life satisfaction falls from 7 to 3. But then over the next 2 waves, they acclimatize to this facial scar. It doesn't bother them as much or whatever it might be. And so their life satisfaction adapts. They have a real change in feelings. And by the time wave 5 comes along, they're a 7 again. Changing reference points, I think, is a huge headache because I would define it as a situation where you scale norm and that provokes a change in feelings. Now, you might think that's kind of a ludicrous claim to make, but I think this is exactly how a lot of sort of Buddhist, Stoic, and other mental mood management techniques work. People encourage you to get off the hedonic treadmill by reframing the way you think about your life. And when you reframe your life in that way, you now feel better about your life. So here I've given an example that's more toxic, where someone wants a $1 million house. That's what they think will make them satisfied. And then they get that $1 million house and their life satisfaction does rise commensurately. But then now they think, okay, well, life could still be better. You know, I could have a $1.5 million house. And then having changed their scale in that way, now not being able to get that $1.5 million house makes them feel actively miserable. And so their life satisfaction declines in real terms.